Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Coming up next on Another View, Race and the Military. We'll talk with author Rawn James Jr. about his new book, The Double V, How Wars, Protest, and Harry Truman Desegregated America's Military. Walk through history as James talks about African-American military service and the double mission of black military members in World War II to fight racism abroad and fascism abroad and racism at home. The fight to desegregate America's armed forces served as a catalyst to the modern civil rights movement. It's an Another View history lesson right after this news from NPR.
Discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
And happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Just want to say very special congratulations again to the honorees of WHRO and Dominion Virginia Power's Community Impact Awards. These awards are given to the unsung heroes in our community who make Hampton Roads a much better place to live, work, worship, and play. And I had the honor of serving as their MC yesterday, and it was a marvelous event. So congratulations again to them. And also a programming note, this coming Sunday, May 19th at 3:30 on WHRO TV 15, we're going to carry a documentary called North Pole Promise. Now, this is about noted neuroscientist and explorer Dr. S. Allen Counter, and he's joining actor James Jones in honoring the centennial anniversary of the North Pole Explorers, and they're going to place a capsule on the U.S. nuclear submarine USS Annapolis. So the program is called The North Pole Promise. It's on WHRO TV 15, our sister station, at 3:30 this coming Sunday, May the 19th. So this year marks the 65th anniversary of President Harry Truman's executive order to desegregate the military. Executive Order 9981, issued by Truman on July 26, 1948, is portrayed as a heroic move, but the reality is the order was the culmination of more than 150 years of legal, political, and moral struggle. In his book, The Double V, How Wars, Protest, and Harry Truman Desegregated America's Military, author Rawn James walks us through the history of African-American participation in America's armed forces, from Crispus Attucks through today. Please welcome author Rawn James Jr. to Another View. Hi, Ron. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm very excited to talk with you about this, particularly since we're here in Norfolk, Virginia, in the Hampton Roads area. So you know that the U.S. Navy is quite prevalent in our area. So this should be a very interesting conversation for many of our listeners. Today is the 59th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. And you posit in your research that all of these changes through the civil rights movement were really started through the integration of the military.
Yes, that's true. Actually, my first book, Root and Branch, traces the legal struggle, that the road to Brown versus Board, so to speak. It's a dual biography of Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall. And when they were finally able to achieve Marshall and his team, Houston had passed by then, when they were finally able to achieve the tremendous victory in Brown for desegregation of America's public schools, the schools on the Department of Defense military bases had already been segregated for a few years. And so the military was able to show what was possible in an integrated America years before what we now call the civil rights movement fully hit its stride.
So the military really is a microcosm of the country, and the things that happen to it have happened to the general population as we move forward.
Yes, it is. It is representative of our nation, and it still is today. Because of my day job, I'm a civilian a trial attorney for the Department of the Navy, and I often visit the Pentagon, and walking through the halls of the Pentagon, one truly sees the tapestry that is America, and one can see it on any military base that he or she goes to. Oh, and I must say, though, I'm speaking only on my own behalf. I'm not speaking at all on behalf of the Department of the Navy.
Absolutely.
Today.
I got that loud and clear, and you are the author of the Double V, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. You know, Ron, when I was reading your book and looking through it, the thing that struck me, and I really want to get your take on this, particularly as an African-American man, the thing that struck me was the tenacity in which African Americans from the very beginning in this country insisted on being able to fight for this country, even though they were treated so horribly at times in this country. And I just wonder, what do you think that made them always want to be on the forefront, even when they weren't allowed to?
That's a very interesting question. You raising that point is I think tenacity is the perfect word for it. Over the course of generations, there were African American men, slave and free, who literally fought for the right to fight. And when they were inducted into the military, particularly into the Army, they were relegated into the service class, and they were put into labor battalions. And those men in the labor battalion said, "No, we want to fight. We're here to fight." And I think what comes to mind most immediately is Frederick Douglass's exhortation to get particularly free black men to join in to fight for the Union, and African Americans did in droves, fought for the Union. And he said, this is really a test for our manhood, and this will show how can a war to free the slaves be fought without African American men. And so it became almost a way of showing our patriotism to the country, even though the country was not recognizing our manhood and even our citizenship. And this goes also through W.B. Du Bois's call during World War I.
You know, it also struck me too. As I was starting to get into the book, was at first blush, you would think, well, why not send the African Americans on the front line? You know, since we're having such issues in the country with living with this group of people, why not send them on the front line and protect our own? But that, in fact, wasn't the case.
No, it was exactly the opposite. And that was part of the reason why I'm excited to be on your show today, is because the Commonwealth of Virginia plays such a crucial role in the evolution of African Americans' participation in the military. The Continental Congress, one of the first acts of the Continental Congress, was to exclude African Americans from the Continental Army. And this was this charge was led by then General George Washington and many of the other wealthy plantation owners in Virginia, because Virginia's population at this time was approximately 50% African American, and the prospect of training black men to use firearms and training them in the military terrified the slave owners. And this was something. This was a theme that we would see repeated throughout history, even after slavery. During the segregation period, one could read the elected officials in the southern states saying, "No, we do not want these bases in our state." They did not want black men who were trained in military bearing to be in their community
because they were afraid that they would rise up.
That's exactly right.
Interesting. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. We're talking about the desegregation of the military and the role of African Americans in all of the wars from the Revolutionary War to the present. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. So even as this country was fighting for its own freedom from England, there was a significant battle in the Hampton Roads area, and I wish you would talk about that a little bit, with Lord Dunmore, I believe his name was.
Yes, there was Lord Dunmore. Lord Dunmore repeatedly threatened the American colonists with freeing the African American slaves that were held, and finally, upon the Revolution, he he did it. What he did was he issued an edict stating that any slave who was able to escape and joined his army in defending the British would thereby have his or her freedom. Or have his freedom, I should say. Mm-hmm. What he ended up with was mostly women and children fleeing to his ship, and it became known as Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. And he had a great deal of women and children, but he also had a large number of men who were willing and able to fight. But then aboard this ship, they all got sick, is really what happened. They got sick, and many of them succumbed to disease. But what's important about this is this was the first time that an individual with the power to do so had directly linked African Americans' military service with their manumission, or might say their citizenship, their rights as men and women.
Mm-hmm. So, and even because this is such a big naval area, the first Navy, I guess, during that time was primarily with African Americans because it wasn't as glamorous a job at that point, the way that the ships were.
No, the United States Navy was fully integrated for much of the nation's early history. Mm-hmm. And you're exactly right, Barbara. This was because the Navy was sail-powered at the time. And so the work was dangerous. One had to scale the rat lines in heavy weather to reduce sail. The pay was meager. The food was notoriously abysmal. And so the Navy often, particularly for the lower ranks, attracted some of the men on the lower rungs of society. And there was no logistically feasible way to segregate the sailors aboard ships. So if one looks at pictures of the Navy in the 19th century, one sees an integrated United States Navy. It was not until the turn of the 20th century when the Navy turned over to being a steam-powered Navy and work aboard a ship was suddenly less arduous that the United States Navy relegated all of its African-American sailors to what was called the steward's class, which is to say it restricted them to cooking and cleaning. Mm-hmm. And that was when the Navy became the most segregated branch of the United States military, except for, I should say, for the Marine Corps, which was and still remains part of the Department of the Navy. The Marine Corps at that time did not accept African Americans at all.
Because I was going to say, each branch of the military really had its own way of dealing with the issue of having African Americans as members of that branch.
Yes, and each branch made African Americans' participation in issue in its own way. And then each branch found itself, as the 20th century drew on, and we were faced with two world wars, each branch found itself tied into knots on how to deal with hundreds of thousands of African Americans in uniform when the branch had committed itself to segregating these individuals.
And then the whole idea of training them and so forth. But we'll get to that in just a moment because our phone lines are lit up. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Ali joins us from Norfolk. Hi, Ali. You're on the air.
Yes, Barbara. Thank you so much. And brother, first I want to say thank you for writing the book. I would love to put your book in my store, too, here. By the way, I own a business here. First things first. My son is in the Marines, and my father fought in the Korean War, and my brother's retired out of the Navy. And I talk to many African Americans in the military all the time about our history, and 99% of them, and the ones I encounter, is absolutely not interested at all in our forefathers' struggle in the military. They don't read no books. They don't know nothing about what happened in San Francisco, July 17, 1944. They know nothing about that DVD, For Love of Liberty. My son is a Marine. I bought him the book of the first black Marines in North Carolina. And it's like the black man in America that's in the military, it's like not all of them, I can't speak for all the ones that I encountered. I mention our history and our struggle, and they're not even interested in the subject.
Okay.
And also, last quick point, that when you use the term slave, slave and slave owner and slave master, we were never slaves. We were.
Ali, we're going to stick to the desegregation of the military. I hear where you're going with that, but let's give Ron an opportunity to respond. Go ahead, Ron.
Well, Lee, first, it's great you taught your sons about the Montford Point Marines, the first African-American Marines. They're truly just a legendary group of men, the first African-Americans who joined what had been an all-white military organization, the last one in the United States. So they're just truly some very tough men. African-Americans still remain overrepresented, to use the popular term, in the United States military. We serve in the military in a larger proportion than our percentage in the population. So I don't know that it's an apathy toward military service, and I believe that perhaps if there's an apathy toward learning the history of African Americans' service in the military, it's because we tend to view it, mistakenly so, as separate and distinct from our history in the civilian population. And what I argue in the Double V is that what became our first victory, the victory of desegregating the military, that was the first victory in what we now call the civil rights movement. Desegregating the military was the most important issue to African Americans in the 1944 election and again in the 1948 election. It united all African Americans as nothing had since emancipation. Because whether one was a graduate of Harvard College or whether one was a sharecropper in Mississippi with a third-grade education, he was drafted into the same segregated military. So there was no way for African Americans to say, well, this affects that class. This doesn't affect, quote, our kind of people. It affected all of us. And it united African Americans as nothing had since emancipation. And so I think that it's a mistake to view African Americans' history of service in the military as separate at all from our history in this country itself. African Americans' military, the history of our service in the military is part and parcel of our history in this country.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to William in Suffolk. Hi, William. You're on the air.
Yeah, Barbara, my dad was a lieutenant in the Navy, and as the Pacific Theater was winding down, he was transferred to Okinawa, and he was a white man, and he was in charge of a black unit that were unloading ships, black stevedores. And they were treated unfairly, not by my dad, but by the system, because they didn't have a good mess hall, and there was a kind of an informal resistance where they were protesting their unfair treatment. And my dad was a very good politician; he settled everything, so there was not a work stoppage. But there was a definite dissatisfaction that these stevedores were not being treated fairly.
William, let me ask you, did your dad talk to you about that difference and why they were being treated differently?
No, it's one of those things, Barbara. I wish I'd sat down with a video camera and gotten a lot of history. It was just something that he mentioned, and he basically said that he was proud that he was able to kind of calm things down so it didn't blow out into something out of proportion. But he did say that they were in a good position because they had all the food they wanted, because all the food was in the ship. So they didn't have to have this mess hall, but they wanted to be treated fairly and to be able to eat with the other guys. Okay,
thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate that. Ron, what about the white officers who were assigned to oversee the black regiments and so forth? I mean, I would imagine there were some good guys and some not so good guys. Yes,
and the point that William implicitly makes is a very important one, and that is that the officers who were in command of the white officers in command of the African American units made a tremendous difference in the experience that the African American enlisted men had, particularly before President Truman's desegregation order, so that one looks even as far back as World War I, and there was Colonel Hayworth, and he was in command of the New York 15th Regiment, and his men were from New York, and many of them were college-educated men, and they had trained to fight. He had trained them very vigorously, and they were prepared to fight, and they were transferred over to Europe during World War I, and they were assigned to a stevedore unit to be laborers, just what William was describing. And Colonel Hayworth, after they worked, and he thought it would be temporary, and things went on for weeks, and Colonel Hayworth went straight to General Pershing, the commander of the Allied forces, and he explained the situation, said, my men want to fight, they're ready to fight, and you're not letting any of the colored soldiers fight. And General Pershing said, if your men want to fight, they can go fight with the French. The French need people. I'm not having any colored soldiers fight under me, directly in the United States command. So Colonel Hayworth took his men to the French officers who were more than happy to have them, and the men became legendary. And in fact, on the cover of my book, many of them were awarded the Croix de Guerre, which is a very high medal in the French army, and the French called them les enfants perdus, just to say the lost children, because their own army had abandoned them to the French.
And the catalyst behind all of this was really a deep-seated belief that African Americans were intrinsically inferior, that they weren't as smart, that they couldn't learn. Yes, and it ended up being something of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that as time went on, when it looks at then Colonel Eisenhower's memo regarding African-American soldiers, and he writes about how poorly they score in the test. There were 5 categories into which a soldier tested. The soldier took the test and was rated in one of 5 categories. And more than 80% of the African-American soldiers tested in the categories 4 or 5, the 2 lowest categories. Of course, this is dealing with a segregated school system, and many of them coming from the South, where they weren't even attending school. And in fact, one of the regiments in World War I, the United States Army agreed to postpone the draft until after the cotton harvest, because all of the soldiers were becoming straight from the cotton fields. They were not attending school. And so when one took all of these soldiers who scored poorly on the test and put them into segregated units where everyone around them scored poorly on the test, the soldiers, on average, did not perform as well as a white unit, whereby the white Southerners performed very poorly on the test as well. And most fell into categories 4 and 5, but they were dispersed among many more units. They weren't all concentrated, so therefore it didn't look like that was an issue for just a group, because they were dispersed throughout everywhere.
That's exactly right.
Wow, this is just fascinating information. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. We're talking about desegregating the military. It's in Another View history lesson. Ron, I want to talk about after World War I and the soldiers came home. Because they were treated differently overseas a bit, and they had to come back to racism and to segregation and what was going on in this country. And there was something in particular that happened in Houston, I believe. Can you talk about that?
Yes, so the Houston Mutiny is truly an important point in American military history. There were the African-American soldiers. This was actually during the war. The African-American soldiers were stationed in Houston, Texas. And this goes back to what we were discussing earlier with Southern politicians not wanting African-American soldiers to train in their cities and towns. And this group, most of the men who were stationed in Houston were from cities in the north. And though the cities in the north were not truly integrated, they could not eat in most restaurants and things like that. Right. It was nothing like the brutally segregated Houston, Texas, in the second decade of the 20th century. And so the men arrived and they encountered epithets. They were greeted with epithets from the white town residents, and over time, the men snapped. And they were led by a sergeant, and they gathered up their arms after this was in response to an African American woman was attacked by a police officer, and the men said, "We're not going to have this anymore." And one soldier came to the rescue of the woman and said, "I will pay whatever fine she has to pay." And that man was beaten and arrested. Word got back to the camp, and the African American soldiers gathered their rifles at night, and they went out through the town, and they went killing any white person they saw. There was a man driving his car down the street. The soldiers stopped him. They ordered him to get out of the car. He refused. They riddled his body with more than 50 bullets. And the townspeople remarked to reporters that the men, the ones who survived, remarked that the men marched with a military bearing, and they were following orders. It was exactly what the Southern white politicians had feared would happen and had told everyone would happen. And it came to pass that these black men had revolted using the training that they had learned from the United States Army. And it The New York Times even remarked afterwards, after there were courts-martial and there were suicides and 13 of them were hanged, and the New York Times remarked in an editorial and said, we do not believe that we can train African-American soldiers in the southern states.
But they really just still did not get the dichotomy between, fighting for your country, putting your life on the line, doing whatever they would allow you to do within the military to save this country, and then to come home and be treated the same in a way that was not respectful.
Right after the war, the hundreds of thousands of black veterans returned from the European theater. And it's important to note that before the war, the phrase was, we will close ranks and stand shoulder to shoulder with our white brothers. So that during the war, the African-American community largely ceased its protest and agitation for their full rights. And it was, W.B. Du Bois famously wrote, we will stand shoulder to shoulder with our eyes lifted to the hills. And the men believed, and the nation believed, that African-Americans of the nation believed, I should say, that if they fought valiantly overseas and served honorably, they'd return and the United States would have to give them their basic civil rights. They returned home to a nation that had grown more hostile to their presence. And the summer of 1919 is called the Red Summer now because there were so many riots and so many racial battles is the only way to describe them. Racial battles throughout cities in the United States. African-American soldiers were killed, sometimes even while still wearing their uniforms, killed because they were wearing their uniforms. Southern politicians on the record, warned returning African-Americans not to wear their uniforms in their southern towns where they would be returning home. And so that's where the term the double V comes from. And during the Second World War, African Americans said, we are not going to stop our agitation at home. This time, military service has changed us, and this time we will seek to change military service. We want a desegregated military, and we are going to fight to defeat fascism abroad and to defeat racism at home. We are going to fight for a double victory.
If you're just joining us, we're talking with Rawn James Jr., author of The Double V, How Wars, Protests, and Harry Truman Desegregated America's Military. So, Ron, talk to us a little bit about the period between World War I and World War II in terms of what was happening in the military with African Americans.
Well, the military was decreased dramatically in size. Between World War I and World War II. And this is when we see I don't want to use the phrase rise to power. This is when A. Philip Randolph truly came to prominence. And he's just such an extraordinary leader. And he clung to the idea that we needed to desegregate the military because, unlike in the civilian population, members of the military have to follow orders. And he believed this is where we could get the first break in the dam, so to speak. And then, lo and behold, by the time we get to the late 30s, many in America came to believe, and rightfully so, that sooner or later we would be entering the war going on in Europe. That, again, we would be a nation at war. And this is when A. Philip Randolph first calls for what we now call a March on Washington. And he formed the Negro March on Washington Committee. And his goal was to get 10,000 African Americans committed to coming to Washington to march for two things. One, to desegregate the military. Two, to desegregate the defense industry, the contractors who were building these weapons that we were suddenly buying at a great rate. He received over 100,000 signatures of adults committed to coming to Washington to march. He was astounded by the response. And this was unlike the March on Washington that took place in 1963, which was a multiracial affair. These were black people. Wow. And this was an ostentatiously black movement. It was the Negro March on Washington Committee. And it became such a problem that in 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt asked Mr. Randolph and his advisors to come to the Oval Office to meet. And they met, and the president explained to Mr. Randolph, said, I need you to call off this march. And he said, I can't do that. And the president asked him, well, how many people are really going to come? And Mr. Randolph said, over 100,000 are going to come, sir. And the president had his White House aides check on that, and they said, yes, by all accounts, look at the newspapers and the magazines, there will be over 100,000 Negroes who are going to come to Washington, D.C. and march on the Mall because they're upset about the desegregation of the military and in the defense industry. And President Roosevelt issued an executive order to desegregate the defense industry. He would not take the full step to desegregate the military, but he did desegregate the civilian defense industry, and Mr. Randolph agreed to postpone, not cancel, but he agreed to postpone his march. And the March on Washington eventually did take place under different leadership in 1963.
But so by desegregating the contractors portion of that, what did that do for African Americans?
It gave African Americans jobs. It had a tremendous boon to our economic life during this time. What was pulling the country out of the Great Depression were these jobs that were popping up to build weapons and to build the things that we needed for the war and things that we were selling to our European allies. And African Americans were excluded from these jobs until after President Roosevelt's order. So it had a tremendous effect on our ability just to live, on the standard of living for millions of African Americans.
But meanwhile, the service, the military branches themselves are still segregated. Then you have groups like the Tuskegee Airmen, the at Montford for the Marines, these other areas where these people are excelling, but not really being able to show that they have excelled.
That's right. The Tuskegee Airmen, who now are widely known, and their success is widely celebrated, and rightfully so. But at the time, when the Army Air Corps, the Air Force was not a separate unit until after World War II. When the Army, the Air Force was a part of the United States Army, and so the Army Air Corps decided it was going to have it was going to train African American pilots. Black people were ecstatic for two reasons. First, all pilots are officers. So this would mean there would be more black officers. And secondly, there was what the Army Air Corps touted at the time as the romance of the sky. There are a few things more glamorous than a fighter pilot. So black folks were ecstatic about this. And they said also that it's so expensive to train pilots that the training will necessarily take place on an integrated basis. There's no way they're going to build a separate facility to train Negro pilots. And then, next thing you know, the Army Air Corps did just that. 40 miles from where its primary training, state-of-the-art training facility, it built the Tuskegee Air Facility for Negro combat pilots. And black people were incredulous. They were infuriated that the Army Air Corps had done this just in driving distance. In 1 hour's driving distance away from its state-of-the-art facility for its white pilots, it was now going to construct a facility for its African-American pilots. And it was the executive director of the NAACP called Tuskegee, quote, a sorry affair. And black people were enraged about it. And over the course of years, because of the performance of those pilots, it has turned into a source of pride for us.
Absolutely. But and also in terms of the military's use of taxpayer dollars, funding, and even within the fighting themselves, they limited themselves because this issue of race was so important that everybody be kept separately.
Yes, it was very expensive to segregate the soldiers, and particularly with World War II, there were so many, hundreds of thousands of soldiers of both races that it became tremendously expensive to keep them segregated, and also to keep such a relatively small number of African American officers in the United States Army. The Navy had no African American officers until the Golden 13, and and that was only 13 officers, and they restricted those men to shore duty. So there was a tremendous inefficiency. If you have a man who, if he were white, would be an officer and would be commanding soldiers in a unit, and you take that same person and you put him in a labor battalion because of his race, you've created an inefficiency there. And that was how civilians later helped convince the Army to fully desegregate, because it became a matter of efficiency for the United States Army. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. John joins us from Norfolk. Hi, John. You're on the air.
Yes, I wanted to give you an account of an example of desegregation prior to the Truman desegregation of the military. There was a middle school in Trenton, New Jersey, largely desegregated when returning officers came back and launched a legal move to have the middle schools of Trenton, New Jersey desegregated. And that was effected in 1944. That account can be researched if you look at the doctoral papers of Roland H. Daniels, Rutgers University.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, John. We appreciate that. Are you familiar with that, Ron?
No, I'm not familiar with the Trenton, New Jersey example, but there were school boards that were responding to these. I guess it was a rising tide. In 1944, certainly very early in that rising tide. But even by the time Brown versus Board of Education, that particular case, as we know, was comprised 5 cases altogether. And but the Board of Topeka, Kansas, had already integrated by the time the case wound its way through the federal court system. So boards of education, operating as independent local bodies that they are in this country, were responding.
Keith joins us from Norfolk. Hi, Keith. You're on the air.
Yeah, how you doing?
Okay.
Yeah, I love your program.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to point out that, the one thing about the service when we involved, just like the Airmen, the Patent Panthers, the Red Ball Express, we were very good at what we did. And see, I'm a government stevedore, very few government stevedores in the United States now. And, so they had to look at the fact that, said these guys are good. We need them, and we had, involved with the turning point in a lot of the wars. Okay. And I also like to point out that Patent Panthers, Wendell Johnson, the black race car driver, was one of the mechanics on that crew.
Okay.
Yeah.
Keith, thank you so much for giving us a call. We appreciate that. Government stevedore, I'm not familiar with that term. Are you? Oh, he's gone. Okay. At any rate, and let's see, we also have Ed joining us from Norfolk. Hi, Ed. You're on the air.
Hello.
Go ahead. You're on the air.
Yes. I just wanted to say that I was in the Marine Corps in early 52, and we had quite a few people that were down at Paris Island, all from the East Coast. And it was during pretty much the height of the Korean conflict. But about half of our platoon, with 98 to 100 men, were African-American, a third to a half at least, I don't remember exactly, but quite a few. And the base was very crowded because of the conflict in Korea. And so our whole platoon, most of the time down there, were in tents. So they had 6 men in a tent. And it just happened in our tent, we had 3 of us guys, and there was 3 they were primarily from New York. And we never had any problem. We got along well together. And I just wanted to say that our drill instructor, I remember his name, I won't give it, but he was very fair with everybody. He was a staff sergeant. And he made sure that everybody was treated equally, I guess you'd say, and he gave no favor to either side.
Okay. Thank you.
That worked out very well for us, and we never had any real problems.
Thank you, Ed. We appreciate that call.
Okay.
I guess, Ron, one of the things that the military may have found out after desegregation was ordered was that when people are forced to work together, that they do get to learn and to know each other.
Yes, they do. And Ed's point about his DI is very important. It harkens a bit back to what William was describing earlier, and that is that the white officers, or in this case a non-commissioned officer, who were in command of these units, and particularly after they became integrated, they had a great deal to do with the success of these integrated units and overall with the success of integration in the United States military.
So just because the decree came down at the end of World War II, the attitudes may not have changed. So what was it like once the Truman said, all right, we want to desegregate all branches of the military? What was really going on inside those branches?
Well, different things in different branches. Yes, the Navy and the Air Force were already on their way to desegregating. And this had to do this was due to their civilian leadership and due to the changing attitudes of their senior leaders, particularly those in Washington. The Army was intransigent. The Army did not. First, when Truman issued the order, it's important to note that a president known for speaking plainly issued an order that, by reading it in 1948, most people had no idea what it meant. So the press went to A. Philip Randolph and said, look at this order. What do you think of President Truman's order? He said, I don't think anything of it. I don't know what it does. And the press went to the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Bradley, and said, what do you think of Truman's order? He said, well, it doesn't require me to desegregate. It says no such thing. So President Truman, a few days later, had to call a press conference and say, my order means desegregation. That's what I intend to do.
Wow.
Desegregate the military. And the Army, even after that, continued to drag its feet. And in fact, it was the Korean War is precisely what changed, what brought about integration finally to the United States Army. And it happened in the most unlikely of places in South Carolina, where the commanding officer of the base would have an influx of young white men and young black men onto his base who had to be trained. And he said, I just can't sort them out. And by sort them out, he meant I can't segregate them. And so he began to train them together, and word spread among the officers who were dealing directly with the soldiers that this is working, and it's time we got on board.
What about leadership and the opportunities for African Americans to come into leadership in the various branches?
That the opportunity to lead, sadly enough, was slow in coming, and by lead I mean move into the senior leadership. One had the case of it was a matter. The question always came back to whether or not the African American senior officers would be commanding white soldiers. And this was something that the senior leaders were not comfortable with. This was something that the civilian political leaders were not comfortable with either. So we had the case of Colonel Charles Young, who was forcibly retired from the United States Army rather than sent to fight in World War I. He was the first African-American graduate of West Point, but he was forcibly retired. The Army suddenly discovered that he had a heart condition. Now, Colonel Young said, he was in Ohio, he said, I have no such heart condition. He picked out his best horse, and he rode the horse straight from Ohio to Washington, D.C. to prove his physical fitness. And his one-man cavalry ride garnered a great deal of press. And he said, look at me, I'm a perfectly fit Army soldier. And the Army said, but you're not. You have a heart condition. We're going to retire you. And it became such a big deal that President Wilson personally wrote a letter to the executive director of the NAACP assuring him that race had absolutely nothing to do with the decision to retire Colonel Young. But, of course, everyone knew that had Colonel Young gone to Europe and performed as he had performed throughout his entire career, the Army likely would have had to make him a general. And there was no way that an individual could be a general in the United States Army and not command white soldiers.
So what about in terms of the Air Force and the Marines? Because you said the Marines stayed all white for a very long time.
Yes, they did. And when they did allow African Americans, the Marines modeled themselves after the Army in that they said, well, we will just have a separate training camp for the African American Marines, and they'll be in separate groups. So a senior non-commissioned officer in the United States Marine Corps, if he was black, would command only black troops, and that persisted for some time.
So do you think that if you were able to talk to, or I guess for World War II vets that are still here, the fact that the commanding officer, the ultimate commander-in-chief, is an African-American has brought us full circle?
Yes, in many ways it has, and that's part of what I wanted to do with the book is with the Double V is begin with Crispus Attucks and take the reader now to our first African American commander-in-chief, President Obama.
And that is just so. What is the final thought that you would like to leave with people about the Double V and about what the military has been able to accomplish in terms of desegregation?
The military, for us, for Americans, unlike most other countries, is both a museum and a mirror. It is a museum of who we were. One can learn so much about American history by studying the history of our military, because our military is not homogeneous; it's a heterogeneous body. So one can look at the women's rights movement, and one can learn a great deal about that by studying military history and the role of the changing role of women in the military, even going through to today. The military is a museum of who we were, but more importantly, it's a mirror of who we are today. Our military looks like our country. And that is one of the greatest things about our military, and it's truly one of the greatest strengths of our military today.
Mm-hmm. And would you still encourage, in terms of leadership today, is it more equal? Is it easier for African Americans to take the leadership role?
Absolutely, and that change began during the Vietnam War and after the Vietnam War is when the senior civilians and senior officers began to see that we need more African American and even then Latino, particularly with Puerto Ricans. Then we need more African American and Latino officers to command our troops, not just Black and Latino troops, but to command all of our troops.
Are you still there?
To make the officer corps look more like the military as a whole.
You know, and when you bring up the Latino population, it reminds me, were other minority groups treated as African Americans were treated in the service, or was our experience unique?
Our experience was unique, mostly because of the large numbers in which we served. The way in which the military treated Japanese American soldiers, the Army treated Japanese American soldiers in particular during World War II, was shameful. Just as the way that the United States government treated Japanese Americans during World War II was shameful. With the Supreme Court case Korematsu versus the United States, in which the Supreme Court agreed that we can intern American citizens in an internment camp because of their race, their heritage. But because of the vast numbers, there were not hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans serving in the military during World War II. And because of our unique history and the fear of armed, military-trained Black men that went from that began, during the colonial period and lasted straight through the Civil Rights Movement.
The book is called The Double V: How Wars, Protest, and Harry Truman Desegregated America's Military. Rawn James Jr., thank you so very much for joining us on Another View. This is a fascinating topic, and I hope that people will check out your book.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Okay, you take care now. And we will be right back.
I am Brother Cornell West, and when I'm in Hampton Roads, I make it a point to listen to Another View with my dear sister Barbara Ham Lee on WHRV-FM.
And welcome back to Another View. From a life of poverty in Uganda to international chess star, Fiona Mutusi has been on a wild ride. Recently, the 17-year-old chess prodigy journeyed to Hampton Roads with her mentor and shared her amazing story with our Lisa Godley.
Ketwe, one of the roughest slums in the entire country of Uganda, a place where residents are often uncertain where their next meal is coming from. But it was here that Fiona Mutusi developed her skill and passion for a popular pastime. Here, in the middle of the slums, she learned to play chess. However, Fiona is quick to point out that that was not her original reason for coming.
It was for it because I was ever hungry and I wanted something to eat. That's why I went to Precious. And it kept me coming back because I wanted something to eat.
Her mentor, Robert Katende, confirms that Fiona's love for chess wasn't instant, but she grew to appreciate it over time.
It was just because there was a meal being served on a daily basis, every after the chess program. So her main goal was to be able to get a meal. And the interest in the chess developed later on, maybe after something like 6 months.
Now, almost 8 years later, Fiona has captured many awards, including Ugandan Junior Girls National Champion and the coveted chess title, Candidate Master. She earned the latter after competing in the World Championship in Turkey. Fiona and her mentor travel to multiple countries on a regular basis. Both agree that the journey has been life-changing.
But I would simply say it has been very overwhelming and amazing. And we cannot comprehend it, but we just continue to give glory to God for what is really happening because it had never been part of our imagination.
I just give thanks to God because whatever is happening, I also can't imagine it.
One stop along that journey was right here in Norfolk.
It was kind of fun because I had never played chess on the battleship. It was my first time, but I had fun and I enjoyed that day. I think I'll never forget that day in my life.
Both Robert and Fiona are elated that this journey is not only a way out of poverty, but has been an inspiration to many.
I've never imagined that from down there in the slums where no one can even dare to go, we can come out of that place and kind of be inspirational people to the rest and get this story to be an inspiring kind of story to the entire world. I do know many people go through different challenges and a lot of suffering. And I think this is just like a point of reference to say that, hey, you have to cling on hope. Never give up. Anything can always happen. So to me, it's quite exciting. And it's been such a very remarkable journey for our lives.
Too much, because I can't believe it to myself.
For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
And this story was produced by WHRO intern and recent ODU graduate Kendall Hairston. Time now for things to view and do in Hampton Roads.
You will be my Saturday love.
You're invited to attend the Berkeley Shopping Center's Health Fair and Community Day, featuring the 3rd annual 5K and 1.5-mile run walk, various health screenings, and live performances. It's tomorrow, Saturday, May 18th, from 10 until 5 at the Berkeley Shopping Center, Berkeley Avenue in Norfolk. Registration for the run begins at 8:30. Call 639-5111 for more information. The Sean Carter, otherwise known as Jay-Z Scholarship Fund, offers higher education scholarships to any underserved student who is a high school senior, college student, and or between the ages of 18 and 25 pursuing studies at a vocational or trade school. The deadline is May 31st. Visit SeanCarterSF.com to apply. ODU Business Gateway presents its 5th annual STEM summer camps. Nano Engineering Camp is for rising 2nd through 5th graders, and Engineers Rule Camp is for 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. There are several sessions for each camp. Call 683-3729 to register. The Urban League of Hampton Roads invites you to the Peninsula Changing Lives Breakfast on Wednesday, May 22nd at 8:30 in the morning at the Thomas Nelson Community College. The event is free, but you must register. Call 627-0864 to reserve your seat. The Yorktown Middle Passage Committee will host a remembrance celebration and wayward sign dedication to honor the 2 million Africans who died in the Middle Passage and the 500,000 enslaved survivors and their descendants who helped build our nation. The ceremony is on Memorial Day, Monday, May 27th at 8 at the Yorktown Monument on the east end of Water Street in Yorktown. It's free and open to the public. Call 757-898-0782 for details. These and other events are on our website, anotherviewradio.org. You can listen to podcasts of previous shows. You can sign up for our once-a-week eView newsletter, or you can drop us a note to let us know how we're doing. Next week, it's Another View on Health, featuring Dr. Keith Newby. Actually, we'll have 3 newbie medical professionals with us to talk about diabetes, what it is, how to treat it, and how to live with it. It's a show chock full of information for you or someone you love who has diabetes. Thank you so much for joining us today. Lisa Godley is on vacation, so a special thanks to Hearsay with Kathy Lewis producer Morgan Chase for filling in. On behalf of Morgan, audio engineer Perry Smith, Kiara Dunstan, who answered our phones, I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Have a fabulous weekend, and let's get together again next Friday at noon for Another View.